Perfect. We'll do that. Very excited to be with all of you today. One of my favorite healthcare conferences because it's different. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the real truth about health as far as I know it. I could be mistaken. I'm sure there'll be mistakes I make along the way. But I'm going to argue to you today that the world's fastest growing brain disease, which is Parkinson's disease, is preventable. And I'm going to argue to you that perhaps other brain diseases, everything including ALS, Alzheimer's disease, and intellectual disabilities, may be to at least some extent preventable, and this might be under our control. So I'm going to talk to you for maybe 35 minutes or so, and then be delighted to take any questions that you have. So first, going to argue to you that Parkinson's disease is a man-made disease. Second, talk to you about its rise and how it's preventable, and then discuss other brain diseases beyond Parkinson's. So in 1962, Rachel Carson wrote this amazing book called Silent Spring. I think it's a great book to be discussing about the real truth about health, because she gave us a vision of what was important in health now 60 years ago. And if we listen to her words and we listen to her testimony in front of Congress, we'll come to the realization that the indiscriminate use of pesticides has adverse health consequences. And in her book in 1962, she said, the farmers spoke of much illness among their families. In the town, the doctor had become more and more puzzled by new kinds of sickness appearing among their patients. And she was not arguing so much against the blanket ban on pesticides like DDT, which in World War II was quite helpful. It prevented the spread of malaria to thousands, if not millions of people. But she was arguing against the indiscriminate use of pesticides like DDT, use of which increased something like 40 to 80-fold after World War II. And you can see, instead of being sprayed to prevent soldiers from getting malaria, it's being sprayed on young children playing on the beach. And if you look at diseases like Parkinson's disease, sometimes we think that they do have a large hereditary component. But in reality, diseases like Parkinson's disease, like ALS, are among the least heritable of all diseases. This is research looking at the heritability of different conditions. And you can see at the top, diseases like schizophrenia and type 1 diabetes, which has childhood onset due to autoimmune destruction of cells in the pancreas, are have a high degree of heritability, whereas diseases like Alzheimer's disease has a modest amount of heritability, different alleles in a gene called ApoE, and Parkinson's disease and breast cancer are near the bottom of the list. Excuse me one second. So if it's not genetics, then what is it? And I'm going to argue to you for Parkinson's disease, there are three major environmental factors that are contributing to the rise of Parkinson's disease in the United States, and to a large extent, these also probably apply to other parts of the world. The first are certain pesticides, including pesticides that Rachel Carson was concerned about in 1962 when she spoke about farmers developing novel illnesses, especially a pesticide called Paraquat. Second is a dry cleaning chemical called trichloroethylene. It sounds intimidating, but it's really not. All of you know that water is made up of three atoms, H2O, two hydrogens, one oxygen. Trichloroethylene is made up of six atoms, two carbons in black, one hydrogen in white, and three chlorines in green. And it's been widely used in degreasing and decaffeinating coffee and dry cleaning, along with its cousin perchloroethylene, which has another chlorine atom and just has four chlorine atoms instead of three. And this chemical is associated with a 500% increased risk of Parkinson's disease. And as we'll see, this is the same chemical that's contaminated the marine-based Camp Lejeune, and why you hear so many commercials about Camp Lejeune, because of the adverse health consequences of it. And I'm going to show you that it's contaminating thousands of sites, likely near where you live and where I do as well. And finally, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about air pollution, which might have been the major contributor to the disease that Dr. Parkinson's described in 1817 in London at the height of the Industrial Revolution. So let's go through each of these in a little more detail. Paraquat is considered the most toxic weed killer ever created. It kills the weeds that Roundup doesn't. It's been used to commit homicide and suicide. And the EPA's own website says one sip can kill. Yet the EPA just last month or two reauthorized its use, even though over 50 countries, including China, have banned this weed killer. The United States permits its use. It's likely today in spring being sprayed over fields throughout the United States, including likely 20 and 30 minutes from where I'm sitting in upstate New York. It's used on corn, on cotton, and on vineyards, among other crops. And use of this weed killer has more than doubled in the last 5 years, for which we have data. And this has been the subject of numerous articles. In December, the LA Times highlighted the adverse effects of Paraquat on Californians, including farmers who are working in the Central Valley who've developed Parkinson's disease. And in 2022, The Guardian, in a British investigative journal, wrote an outstanding piece on Paraquat. Farmers like those in California have been suing the manufacturer because of their Parkinson's disease. As part of that, the company has, as part of the discovery process, has given a lot of reports that The Guardian reviewed, and their headline was that secret file suggests that the chemical giant feared the weed killer's link to Parkinson's disease, and in many cases taught to obscure, hide it, or discredit researchers who sought to reach different conclusions through their science. These are just some of the findings from the reporting from The Guardian. Paraquat was developed in the late 1950s and introduced in the United Kingdom in 1962, then in the United States. In 1963, the company found that skin exposure to high doses of Paraquat in rabbits caused weakness in coordination. And then they found that large doses of Paraquat in some rats and mice result in stiff gait or tremors. In 1968, poisoning deaths and suicides, including in Singapore, began to rise. 1974, regulators are concerned that workers, quote, might inadvertently lick small quantities of Paraquat residue off their lips or inhale Paraquat mist. Rumors circulate almost 50 years ago that some of the EPA have favored banning Paraquat, something the EPA has yet to do, even though it's been discussed for half a century. In 1975, companies were concerned that long-term spraying could injure the brain and spinal cord. 1976, autopsy of a brain from farm workers showed degenerative changes in the cells of the substantia nigra, which are the areas of the brain that we know are directly affected in Parkinson's disease. In 1985, a scientific article showed an extraordinarily high, almost perfect correlation between pesticide use and Parkinson's. An internal company memo warns that Paraquat could become a huge legal liability like asbestos and can go on for decades. And they were exactly right. So what is this? What's happening when a chemical company does research showing that their pesticide, when fed to 3 different mammalian species, produces the clinical or pathological features of Parkinson's disease and seeks to cover it up? I shared this with my friend, Professor Ray, who's an English professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And he said, Ray, this is agnotology. And if you're like me, I was like, what in the world is agnotology? Well, he says, science is the production of knowledge, ideally for the public's good. Agnotology is the production of ignorance, often for commercial gain, and classically used by tobacco companies who sought to sow seeds of doubt about the health effects of their product. It's later been applied to the opioid pandemic and to social media, where companies increasingly are being demonstrated to have known about the adverse health consequences of their products or services, have sought systematically to hide those risks from the public in the name of commercial benefit. And if this is being applied to Paraquat and to Parkinson's disease, we should be asking to what other chemicals this is being applied to for what other diseases. Trichloroethylene, as I mentioned, I think may be another important cause of Parkinson's disease. In fact, I'm a little bit on the crazy side. I think trichloroethylene might be the most important cause of Parkinson's disease in the United States. And it's been used for a wide range of products. In 1970, 2 pounds per American of trichloroethylene was produced. It's estimated that 10 million people worked with the chemical, including aircraft and jet engine mechanics, automobile workers, computer specialists, dry cleaners, embalmers, painters and printers, sewage workers, shoemakers, taxidermists, weapons specialists, and varnish workers. It's had a wide range of commercial and consumer uses, everything from decaffeinating coffee in the 1970s to degreasing metal. It's a paint remover used in the production of refrigerants, even found in typewriter correction fluid, and a host of industrial uses, including automotive care. If you worked as a mechanic and sprayed a chemical on an engine and the grease melted away, that might have been trichloroethylene. Been used in the computer and electronics industry, including in Silicon Valley. If you've worked with electrical equipment in the 1950s, 60s, or 70s, you were likely working with trichloroethylene. It was so ubiquitous that it was even used to anesthetize patients, especially pregnant women. This is a quote from the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology by Dr. Charles Flowers in 1956, in which he says that trichloroethylene is a potent analgesic drug. Its margin of safety and ease of administration will also ultimately make it a standard agent on all delivery floors. Trilene's wide variety of uses will probably allow almost every obstetrician to find a place for it in his obstetrical practice. So if this is being used to anesthetize pregnant women, you can imagine how widely it was used. Unfortunately, research shown over a decade ago by Dr. Caroline Tanner and her colleague, Dr. Sam Goldman, showed that TCE, that hobby or occupational exposure to TCE, trichloroethylene, is associated with a 500% increased risk of Parkinson's disease. And like smoking and lung cancer, you don't smoke a cigarette and develop lung cancer the next day. It takes years of exposure and years after that for the disease to manifest. They found that the time lag between exposure and diagnosis of Parkinson's disease ranged from 10 to 40 years. And because of its widespread use, they said that the potential public health implications are substantial. Parkinson's disease turns out to be only one of the adverse health consequences of TCE. Its big risk is that it causes cancer. This isn't my opinion. This is the opinion of the World Health Organization, which says that TCE is carcinogenic to humans. The Department of Health and Human Services says it's known to be a human carcinogen, and the EPA says it's carcinogenic in humans by all routes of exposure, because you can work with it and come in contact with your skin. You can breathe it in because it's readily volatile, hence its use in dry cleaning, and it can contaminate groundwater, where it's contaminated up to 30% of groundwater in the United States. According to a report from the CDC, exposure to TCE was associated with excess incidences of liver cancer, kidney cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, prostate cancer, and multiple myeloma. Recently, in January of this year, the Wall Street Journal ran a front-page article highlighting that cancer rates among Americans under the age of 50 are increasing at the same time that smoking rates are decreasing. So what's causing cancer rates among young adults to be rising at the same time that smoking rates is decreasing? It can't be aging, it can't be screening, because generally we don't screen for most cancers until age 50. Can't be genetics because it's too short of a time period. And so it leaves us with the concerning conclusion that it might be our environment and it might be toxins that we're releasing into our food, water, and air, including chemicals like trichloroethylene. Trichloroethylene really, is in the public eye right now because it contaminated the marine base Camp Lejeune between 1953 and 1987, where 1 million Marines, their families, their dependents, and civilians were exposed to unsafe levels of TCE in the water that they were drinking at the base. And then Dr. Caroline Tanner and Sam Goldman, same individuals who did that earlier twin study, recently investigated the number of people who developed Parkinson's at the Marine base Camp Lejeune compared to a Marine base on the West Coast called Camp Pendleton that was much less contaminated with trichloroethylene. And when they looked at 340,000 service members, they found that the risk of Parkinson's was 70% higher in Camp Lejeune veterans. Now, mind you, these are Marines who are almost by definition healthy. They were all young, average age was 20, and they were only at the Marine base for just over 2 years. Yet 35 years later, healthy Marines were developing Parkinson's disease at a level 70% higher than those at a much less contaminated base. And the tragedy of all this is that the Marines knew about this contamination, at least for the latter portions of the year, and took no action to protect the best and brightest among us. In addition to working with it or being exposed to a military base, thousands, if not millions of us are exposed to this through outdoor air, contaminated water, and something called vapor intrusion. Many of you know that radon can evaporate from the soil, enter people's homes, especially basements, and cause lung cancer. Well, TCE can contaminate groundwater, which is, depending on where you live, 15 to 50 feet before the surface. And TCE can then form underground rivers or plumes and then evaporate into people's homes, schools, and workplaces undetected. In Rochester, we evaluated a cohort of attorneys who worked in an office building that was next door to a contaminated dry cleaning site. Of the 79 attorneys that we evaluated, 4 had Parkinson's disease and 15 had a cancer related to TCE. We also evaluated 75 attorneys who weren't partners in that law firm, and we only found 1 individual with Parkinson's disease and 4 individuals with cancer. These sites are around us everywhere. I went to high school in Newport Beach, California, so I thought to myself, where is the last place in the world that you would find an industrial chemical like trichloroethylene? So I said, it must be Newport Beach. So I Googled trichloroethylene in Newport Beach, only to find that a former aerospace facility less than a half mile from where I went to high school at Corona Del Mar High School was contaminated with trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene. This used to be a major aerospace facility for 30 plus years, located about 3 miles from the Pacific Ocean and some of the most expensive real estate in Southern California. After the closure of this aerospace unit in 1993, the facility was demolished and it was rezoned for from industrial use to residential use. As a part of a series of studies, they eventually found that trichloroethylene and other chemicals were found in high levels in the soil gas in this area. And in 2022, they found that TCE and PCE were detected above screening levels in the indoor air of 123 homes in Newport Beach, California. And they thought this process of vapor intrusion, whereby TCE or PCE evaporates from contaminated groundwater or soil and enters people's homes, occurred in 27 homes and was found in high levels in people's master bedrooms, in their living rooms, and in their children's playrooms. These homes were offered air purifying units, and until perhaps very recently, well, to my knowledge, no systematic health assessments have occurred of the current or former residents in Newport Beach, California. And this plume is present, it's moving, and it's being monitored. And so this is Jamboree Road, which leads down to Pacific Coast Highway about 3 miles south. And this is up here in the upper left-hand corner is where I went to high school, Corona Del Mar High School, and this is a church. And you can see these purple boxes are monitoring wells, and I'll show you a picture. This is what a monitoring well looks like. This is one right near my high school, which happens to be right back here in the background. And that's that SG73 is a picture of that monitoring well that I showed. Fortunately, that one hasn't shown to be elevated levels, at least as far as I could see through 2019. But other monitoring wells in Newport Beach, California, right next to a very expensive golf course, and right near homes have found TCE, trichloroethylene, and perchloroethylene to be elevated at levels that are much orders of magnitude higher than that which have been deemed to be safe. So that's trichloroethylene as another potential cause of Parkinson's disease. The third is air pollution. So when Dr. Parkinson was describing the disease that would later bear his name in 1817, he said he was describing something new. He said tremor had long since been described, but this disease where people have a stooped over posture, have a pill rolling tremor, a tendency to walk faster and faster and to fall forward. It was something new, something that had not been classified in the medical literature. And what's going on in 1800 London? Well, 1800 London had terrible air pollution. It had 20 times the level of air pollution that's present in London today. It had air pollution that's on par with what's in Delhi, India, and Beijing, China today. And it had twice as much as the air pollution that was found during the 1950s, when the Great Smog of London led to mass hospitalizations, thousands of deaths, and the first Clean Air Act 3 or 4 years later. For those of you who watched the Netflix, the series The Crown, this is the Great Smog of 1952 that occurred when Winston Churchill was Prime Minister. And studies have since linked air pollution. And when you see air pollution, when you see the smog over Los Angeles, you're actually seeing little pieces of dirt and soot suspended in the air. Those pieces of dirt and soot have a fancy term. It's called particulate matter. Some are large and they're readily coughed out or sneezed out, but some are really small, about 1/30th the width of your hair. And they can enter the nose, that's responsible for smell. And hitchhiking on those little pieces of dirt and soot are toxic metals, iron from brakes, lead from leaded gasoline, platinum from catalytic converters. And if you look at areas of the country that have high particulate matter, you can see it's in the upper Midwest, the South, and the Central Valley of California. And if you look at map of new cases of Parkinson's disease, you see that they tend to be higher in the Central Valley of California, in parts of Texas, in the Southeast, and the Midwest, where areas of air pollution are high. A study done by my colleague, Dr. Brad Rosette, and his colleagues at the Barrow Institute in Arizona recently found a strong association between particulate matter and Parkinson's disease. In red are areas of the country that had high rates of Parkinson's disease and high rates of particulate matter. And you can see it again in the upper Midwest. You can see it in, for example, parts of Texas, as we were showing. Conversely, in dark blue are areas of the country with low levels of air pollution, with relatively clean air, and with relatively low rates of Parkinson's disease. And so how do these toxicants in our food, water, and air interact with our body? Well, if you think about it, I'll stop there. One of my colleagues, Dr. Per Borkhammer, a really smart Danish scientist, has postulated that Parkinson's disease begins in either the body, and when he says body, he's saying begins in the gut, or it begins in the brain. And he says if it begins in the body, it spreads from the gut up the spinal cord, and then into the part of the brain that's responsible for Parkinson's disease, which would be area number 4, the substantia nigra, for those who like a lot of science, and then to other parts of the brain. Conversely, if it begins in the brain, it begins in the smell center, the olfactory bulb, in area number 1, and then spreads downward through the spinal cord into the parts of the brain that are responsible for tremor and slowness of movement, and then only later down into the intestine. And if you think about this model, it really merges nicely with how these toxicants come into contact with our body. So we either ingest these toxicants, like the Marines at Camp Lejeune, who were ingesting trichloroethylene or TCE or perchloroethylene in the water that they were drinking, potentially leading to a gut-first model of, or body-first model of Parkinson's disease, in which the misfolding of a protein called alpha-synuclein begins in the gut and then rises up through the spinal cord to the lower parts of the brainstem that are responsible for sleep disturbance and for regulation of blood pressure, then to the parts of the brain that are responsible for movement and tremor, and then to the parts of the brain that are responsible for thinking and can cause dementia. Some of these, including trichloroethylene, can also be inhaled, or Paraquat can be inhaled, in which case the pathology might begin first in the smell centers of the brain, something called the olfactory bulb, then spread to the parts of the brain that are responsible for movement and tremor, such as the substantia nigra, and then only later spread down the spinal cord or into the cortices, causing later manifestations of constipation or later manifestations of difficulties with thinking. So that's how Parkinson's disease might be man-made. Now I'm going to talk to you about the rise of Parkinson's disease and conclude with this section on how it may be preventable. So when Dr. James Parkinson described the condition in 1817, he described 6 individuals with the disease. In 2017, the global burden of disease estimated that 6 million people had Parkinson's disease. So how do you go from a disease affecting 6 people to 6 million in just 2 centuries? Well, it can't just be aging alone, and it can't be genetics. It's got to be our environment. And right now, Parkinson's is the fastest growing brain disease in the world. Over the last 25 years, the number of people with Parkinson's disease has more than doubled. And if we don't change its course, the number of people affected by the disease will double again in the coming 25 years. Just to give you a feel for how common Parkinson's disease is, 200 Americans today will be diagnosed with the disease, and 100 Americans today will die from the disease. So the good news to all this is that if it's man-made, if Parkinson's disease is due to toxins in our food, water, and air, then it can be human-ended. And there's only one high-quality study that I'm aware of that has shown that the incidence or number of new cases of Parkinson's disease is falling. And that was a study done in the Netherlands called the Rotterdam study, in which they found a 60% decrease in the incidence or number of new cases of Parkinson's disease in a relatively short period of time. They were unable to provide, they didn't have a clear reason for their finding of a decreasing prevalence or incidence of Parkinson's disease. So I went backwards and looked at the 3 different environmental risk factors that I think are contributing to Parkinson's disease. Ideally, you would like to follow changes going forward, but we didn't have that data. So I went backwards and looked and found that the levels of pesticides, trichloroethylene, and air pollution in the Netherlands were all decreasing in the years or decades leading up to this decrease in the incidence of Parkinson's disease. For example, in pesticides like DDT and other pesticides, they dissolve in our fat. So you can actually measure these chemicals in your fatty tissue. And between 1968 and 1986, in a relatively short period of time, their levels fell between 75 to 90% in our fatty tissue. In 1981, trichloroethylene levels in the outdoor air in the Netherlands were among the lowest in all of Europe. And air pollution, emissions of common air pollutants decreased by more than 50, in some cases up to 90% in the years leading up to the fall in the incidence of Parkinson's disease. So when we see areas of the world, at least in this study, that have decreasing use of pesticides, decreasing use of trichloroethylene, decreasing levels of air pollution, we see decreasing numbers of people being diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. So I've discussed with you how Parkinson's disease might be a man-made disease and thus fundamentally preventable. So when you think about Parkinson's disease, I want you to think that Parkinson's disease is a preventable disease in the vast majority of cases. And this may be true also for other brain diseases. Now I'm going to give you a few examples. Pesticides many pesticides are nerve toxins, and perhaps not surprisingly, they're associated with a wide range of brain diseases, including intellectual disabilities. This is a study done by Dr. Virginia Rao, who's an outstanding researcher at Columbia University in New York. And she's been following children who've been exposed to a pesticide called chlorpyrifos in urban environments in New York City. Now, chlorpyrifos, you may not know, but if you've eaten an apple in the last few years, last 5-10 years, you've likely eaten chlorpyrifos, because over half of apples in the United States have chlorpyrifos on them. And chlorpyrifos is a nerve toxin. That's how it works. And in this study, they looked at levels of chlorpyrifos, abbreviated CPF, and the umbilical cord blood of babies, of fetuses, when they were born. And then they correlated the level of chlorpyrifos in the umbilical blood. So this is the blood that's coming from the mother passing in through the placenta to the baby, and found that the higher the level of chlorpyrifos in the umbilical cord blood, the lower the IQ was. They report evidence of deficits in working memory and intelligence quotient as a function of prenatal exposure. They found this at age, I believe, 5 years of age, and in this study at age 7. So the environment, your exposure to pesticides for women passing it to their babies is associated with their intellectual abilities at 5 years and at 7 years. And they report that these findings are important in light of continued widespread of chlorpyrifos in agricultural settings and possibly longer-term educational implications of cognitive deficits. A separate study estimated that pesticides like chlorpyrifos cost 26 million American children 17 million IQ points. Intellectual disabilities is not the only disease that's linked to pesticides. ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, is likely linked to pesticides as well. Multiple studies, including those done in Italy, have linked soccer playing to ALS. This study looked at new cases of soccer players among Italian players, and they found 8 individuals with ALS, whereas the number of expected cases was only supposed to be about 1.2. So the standardized morbidity ratio, which is a fancy way of saying that there was a 6 times higher rate of of ALS among soccer players than would be expected, an outcome that's very, 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 very unlikely to be explained by chance. And in this study, they also compared soccer players to basketball players and cyclists, finding that there was no basketball player or cyclist who developed ALS, suggesting that it's something perhaps inherent to the sport soccer that's linked to ALS. And so what are the 2 things that are inherent to soccer playing that wouldn't be found typically with basketball players or cyclists? Second is repeated head trauma from heading the ball. And the first is the head trauma from repeat heading the ball. And the second is potentially exposure to pesticides on soccer fields, exposure either through the skin for direct contact with the skin with pesticides, or inhaling these pesticides while playing, or bringing pesticides home on your soccer cleats and having that pesticide be exposed to in your own residence. A third environmental risk factor is air pollution, which may be a major contributor to Alzheimer's disease. These are just 2 studies just from this year. One, a report in the media in Scientific American talking about how airborne toxins increase our risk for cognitive disability and disease. And a second in an academic journal called Neurology, showing an association of that particulate matter, the small pieces of dirt and soot that you see in the smog, and Alzheimer's disease pathology. And we're all being exposed to this. So if many of you remember the Canadian wildfires, especially if you lived in the Northeast, in this past summer, and this is a picture of New York City when the skies over the Big Apple turned orange. And this level of particulate matter in June in 2023 is exactly what the skies over London may have looked like when Dr. Parkinson described Parkinsons in 1817, because the level of particulate matter in New York City in June 2023 is on par with what was found in 19th century London. So if you're interested in how toxicants in our food, water, and air are contributing to brain diseases from autism to Alzheimer's disease, I invite you to our symposium on the brain and environment in Washington, D.C. on May 20th, so just next month. You can learn more about the symposium and register for this symposium at our website, brainandenvironment.org, and there's a QR code for those that might be interested. I'm going to leave you on a high note, I hope. And the high note is that we can change the course of diseases. And in fact, we've changed the course of diseases multiple times in the past. We live in a world that's free of smallpox because we developed a vaccine for smallpox. We live in a world where typhus and where yellow fever and where many different infectious diseases are extraordinarily rare. And in many cases, because ordinary people like you watching this broadcast have changed the course of diseases because you've said we've had enough. And in 1938, communities throughout the United States, including swimming pools, houses of worship, would all close down this summer because they were fearful of the spread of polio. Ordinary Americans had enough, and they contributed dimes and mailed them to the White House because President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had polio. And they thought, if we raise enough money, we can change the course of polio. And they did. 17 years after the March of Dimes began, Jonas Salk in Pittsburgh developed a vaccine that protected people against polio. Today, we live in a world that's largely free of polio. We have no cure for polio. We have no highly effective treatments for polio. We just live in a world where polio almost doesn't exist. In 1980, a 13-year-old girl was struck by a drunk driver, knocked out of her shoes, and killed. 4 days later, her mother, Candace Lightner, is lobbying the state legislature in California to change the laws against drinking and driving. At that time, drinking and driving was legal in some states in the United States, and she said it was this only socially permissible form of homicide in society. Within 8 years, she and her colleagues had formed Mothers Against Drunk Driving. The drinking age in the United States is raised from 18 to 21. Drinking and driving is illegal in all 50 states, and the blood alcohol level is dropped to 0.08. Today, because of the efforts of Candace Lightner, who's still living, and her colleagues, 10,000 fewer children, 10,000 fewer Americans die from drinking and driving per year. 10,000 schools, 10,000 communities, 10,000 families are not ripped apart because of the efforts of people like Candace Lightner, who made drinking and driving socially unacceptable and illegal. 7 years after Candace Lightner found her megaphone and changed the course of drinking and driving, not just for America, but around the world, Larry Kramer and his fellow activists formed a group called ACT UP in New York City because people in his community were dying from a uniformly and rapidly fatal condition known as AIDS. And in the setting of huge discrimination, they adopted a motto of silence equals death, because for people like Larry Kramer and his peers, silence equaled death. And they changed the course of HIV by barricading themselves in the streets of New York, by overtaking the New York Stock Exchange, by taking over pharmaceutical companies who were developing effective treatments for HIV, but were making them too expensive and therefore inaccessible to the people who needed them the most. Within 8 years, after Larry Kramer and his colleagues formed ACT UP, we had the first protease inhibitors that could be used to treat HIV. And today, HIV is associated with a near normal life expectancy. Even more powerfully, millions of us, including possibly many of you listening, including possibly me, don't have HIV because we figured out how to prevent HIV with a simple intervention called a condom. If we can change the course of polio, if we change the course of drinking and driving, if we change the course of HIV and AIDS, we can change the course of brain diseases, which today are the leading source of disability in the entire world. We have obligations to receive gifts, and these are all gifts we received from previous generations, but we also have an obligation to reciprocate. And I think we need to act now in our generation to make these brain diseases, including intellectual disabilities, including autism, including ALS, including brain cancer, including Parkinson's disease, including Alzheimer's disease, all increasingly rare, not increasingly common. In our book, Ending Parkinson's Disease, we provide a prescription for beginning that journey. All the authors are donating all their proceeds from the sales of these books to efforts to prevent and end Parkinson's disease. And if you can't afford a copy of the book, if you just email us at info@endingpd.org and give us your mailing address, we'll send you a copy for free, especially if you live in the United States. So if you can't afford a copy of this book and you want to learn about how we can prevent and end Parkinson's disease, just email us at info@endingpd.org, and we'd be delighted to send you one. Also, if you've worked with these chemicals or worked with pesticides or have thoughts or suggestions or at points of disagreement or want to educate me on some topic related to any of these brain diseases, I'd love to hear from you. You can email me at info@endingpd.org. And with that, I'd be delighted to take any questions that you have.
Great. Thank you so much for the information that you shared, Dr. Dorsey. So obviously a little nerve-wracking trying to stay healthy in this world when even the air we breathe is dangerous, and even places where we think are safe, like where we grew up, may be, right near an area that is so toxic. So Now we're going to begin the Q&A portion. Just real quickly, if you want to check out Dr. Dorsey's books, you can go to our website and you can find what books he has available. And then you can, go to Amazon or do you sell these on your website as well, Dr. Dorsey?
No, just through Amazon. They're also in libraries. And again, if you can't afford a copy, they're also in other bookstores. If you can't afford a copy, just email us info@endingpd.org and we'll send you one for free.
All right, great. For anyone in the audience that would like to ask any questions, you can raise your hand in Zoom. The instructions on how to do so are in chat. Note that we don't take any questions directly from chat, so please raise your hand in Zoom if you'd like to ask a question. So I know you do work with or have done work with Michael J. Fox and his organization. Can you describe what kind of work that he does? Does he talk about the chemical causes of it, or does he just talk about his own experience? What's happening with that kind of work?
Michael J. Fox had an interview with Jane Pauley recently, in which she asked him how he thought he got Parkinson's disease. My understanding is he's pursued genetic testing, and that 85% of Americans that don't have an identifiable genetic risk factor. And he said in the interview with Jane Pauley that he got exposure. He thinks he got Parkinson's from exposure to some kind of toxin. And if, what a great legacy for us. Michael J. Fox has been the face of Parkinson's disease now for 30 years. I mean, his suffering is that of biblical proportions. He can't even walk down the streets of New York without falling over. Shouldn't we take it upon ourselves to support people like Michael J. Fox, find out what these toxins are that are causing Michael J. Fox to suffer as much as he has, and to make sure that we minimize or eliminate these toxins so that future generations do not have to suffer like Michael J. Fox has? I mean, I think there are things that we can do and things that, quite frankly, we have the responsibility to do to change the course of these diseases.
And are these toxins that cause the disease, according to your research, are they still in the body? Can they be tested for to see how much we have? Could we look at Michael J. Fox and say, okay, you have Parkinson's. Let's look at all the toxins in your body. Oh, you've got a disproportionate amount of this, and do this over a population of people with Parkinson's over the general public.
So there are a few things that you can see. So we know that in the brains of people with Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease, there's high levels of heavy metals in people's brains. So the natural consequence, some people might ask, well, what about taking those metals out? So there was actually a study looking at chelation therapy, removing iron from brains of individuals with Parkinson's disease. The drug got to keep the iron out, but people's Parkinson's disease got worse, much worse, and their health was exacerbated by the chemicals. So in some cases, it's really hard, and you can even get these chemicals out, but it might have adverse health consequences. Certain things that dissolve in your fat are really hard to get rid of. So I mentioned that certain pesticides can be dissolved in the fat and be stayed in the fat. And so we saw in that study in the Netherlands that levels of pesticides, A, are found in people's fat, and B, can decrease over time. It's also worth noting that the only time we really excrete some of these things is, for example, when women nurse. So you can find pesticides in the breast milk of nursing women. And obviously those pesticides are then passed on to their children when they nurse. And those children have growing, developing, less protected brains, and might be exquisitely sensitive to the effects of these pesticides in them. Other chemicals like trichloroethylene, if you have ongoing exposure, you can find them in the blood or in the urine. So a study in Italy found trichloroethylene, this chemical, in the urine of 3/4 of men in Italy, I believe in the 1990s. The challenge is once you stop the exposure, if you've had exposure to this, like the Marines 30 years ago, as far as I know, you can't detect it in the body years after the effect.
So what is the determining factor as to why some people might get Parkinson's disease and why others might not, given if two people or a group of people grow up in the same area, have the same level of exposure? I assume that if one person gets it, doesn't mean they're all going to get it. What might be the difference between why one person might get Parkinson's and another doesn't? And does that open it up to being a genetic predisposition should one be exposed to these chemicals?
So genetics plays a role, but a small role. So let's think about two brothers or two siblings who smoke. If one gets lung cancer, does that mean the other one's automatically going to get lung cancer? No. In fact, only 10% of smokers get lung cancer. Does smoking cause lung cancer? Absolutely. If you don't smoke, your likelihood of getting lung cancer is really, really, really remote. And if you don't get exposure to chemicals like radon, air pollution, and asbestos, it's even really, 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 really small. So there have to be other factors that determine when people are exposed to a toxin, whether that's smoking cigarettes or Paraquat, what determines whether someone develops the disease or not. I'm going to give you three main factors. The first is exposure, and probably the most important. We have to, what was the dose of exposure? What was the duration of exposure? And when were you exposed? I think for many of these brain diseases that exposure in early childhood, even in utero, is especially important because we know it takes years, if not decades, for these diseases to unfold, and therefore, earlier exposure is more likely to become manifest than later exposure, and it's quite possible that young children, for example, are more sensitive to the effects. So one is exposure. The second is interactions. So interactions with genetic factors, as you mentioned. So about 15% of people carry a genetic risk factor for Parkinson's disease. For the vast majority of that 15%, for 90+% of that 15%, those genetic risk factors are insufficient to cause the disease. Only about 1 out of every 100 people with Parkinson's disease have the disease from a purely genetic cause. But those genetic risk factors have interactions with some of these toxicants. So for example, a common mutation called LARC2 affects about 2 to 3% of people with Parkinson's disease, has synergistic effects in animal models when exposed to pesticides. So there could be genetic interactions. There's also probably differences in the way individuals metabolize these pesticides that might lead some individuals to be more susceptible to their toxic effects and others less susceptible. But in addition to genetic interactions, there are likely environmental interactions. So someone could be exposed to pesticides and dry cleaning chemicals. Someone could be exposed to pesticide A and pesticide B. And some people could be exposed to pesticides and head trauma, for example, which we know amplifies the risk of Parkinson's disease. And then likely in the interactions is chance. Dr. Borkhammer points out that chance likely plays a role in who develops cancer and likely in who develops Parkinson's disease. And the third are factors that modify the disease itself or the pathological process, age being probably the biggest one. As we get older, our ability to handle these misfolded proteins decreases. Other things like other diseases, intercurrent illnesses, stress, all might modify the disease progress. So one is the level of exposure itself and timing of it. Second is our interactions with genetic, environmental, and chance factors. And the third are modifiers.
And when, given someone's exposed to it at a relatively young age, we don't see children often, I assume, with Parkinson's disease. It's something that I've personally heard of. When does it tend to express itself? And are there particular triggers that cause it to express itself at any given time?
We also have a listener with a question. So the rates of Parkinson's disease triple every decade, beginning in the 40s. So the incidence, number of new cases triples every decade, beginning in the 40s. There's one other disease that has that exact same pattern, and that's lung cancer. Lung cancer and Parkinson's disease essentially are almost non-existent before age of 40. If we all died from a car accident or whatever it is at age 40, almost none of us would ever develop Parkinson's disease or lung cancer. It doesn't mean that these factors, that smoking or that some of these pesticides don't cause or contribute to the disease. It just means it takes years of likely exposure and years or decades for these diseases to unfold or manifest themselves. As I alluded to, in some cases, Parkinson's disease might begin in the nose, some cases in the gut, and by the time it gets all the way back to the parts of the brain that are responsible for movement and tremor, it takes years or decades for that actually to take place. So you need to live a relatively long life for the diseases to become manifest.
And given that this is environmental and, where you want to go play soccer, you don't realize this stuff is out in the field and you want to, I don't know, do something crazy like breathe oxygen. You're exposed. I know it's radical thinking. How do we protect ourselves from or at least how do we decrease the likelihood that we're going to get Parkinson's? This is one of those diseases that I think really scare people because you can live a while and yet your life really shrinks to a really challenging experience. So what would you suggest is the best ways to protect ourselves?
Yes, I mean, who wants to spend the last 20 years of their life losing their independence with Parkinson's, and who, quite frankly, wants to spend 20 years of their life caring for someone with Parkinson's disease? So I'll tell you what they do in China. They're so concerned about air pollution in China that for some of the schools, they build domes around the school and the soccer field so the kids can go outside and play soccer without breathing in the toxic air. Now, obviously, that's not a very practical solution, but there are some practical solutions. Some states have banned the use of pesticides on playing fields at schools. You know, kids can play soccer with fields that have weeds. That can be done. If you belong to a golf course, you can ask your golf course, you know, what are you spraying on the golf course and for what purpose? Can we get by with less pesticides? Can we get by with less toxic pesticides? Are there alternatives to doing so? There are studies that link green space workers, you know, landscapers, for example, to both to ALS and to Parkinson's disease. So I'll tell you very practically what I do in my life since writing this book is I buy organic. I'm a physician, so I have the means to do so, but it's a lot cheaper to buy organic than it is to have Parkinson's disease. I wash all my fruits and vegetables, even the organic ones, which still have residues of pesticides on them, and with water and soap. I use a vegetable wash from Trader Joe's. So I have a glass bowl. I put all my fruit in a bowl and I wash them with soap and water. And then before I eat them, I put a carbon filter, like something from Pure or Brita, on my faucet at home. If I got my water from a well, which 40 million Americans do, up to 40 million Americans do, I'd have that well tested for pesticides and these chemicals like trichloroethylene, especially if I lived in suburban or urban environments. Wells are not regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act, so don't have the same protections that municipal or city water has in place. I like to bike, and so I wear a helmet anytime I bike. If I skied, I'd wear a helmet because head trauma is associated with ALS, it's associated with dementia, and it's associated with Parkinson's disease. I avoid dry cleaning. I launder all my shirts, and when I do, the rare times I do get anything dry cleaned, I use a dry cleaner that doesn't use chemicals like trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene, which are associated with Parkinson's disease. If I lived in a heavily polluted area, I would have an air purifier in my home. I would put one in my kitchen and in my bedroom. If I were driving through heavy traffic, I would roll up my windows, turn on my air conditioner, and recirculate the air. So I think there are lots of things that we can do in an individual life. We're writing a second book, a sequel to it, in which we're going to have the Parkinson's 25 things that ordinary individuals can do to lower their risk of Parkinson's disease, and likely, I think, perhaps slow the rate of progression for people who already have the disease. That needs to be demonstrated. But I think there are lots of things we can do in an individual life to lower our risk of developing these brain diseases. But fundamentally, you know, short of building domes over neighborhoods or over schools, these are societal decisions, and we need to hold our representatives accountable for creating a clean environment where we have an expectation of clean water, clean food, and clean air, and that expectation is met with reality.
Thank you. So during the pandemic, there was research that suggests that people who that lived a whole food plant-based lifestyle and generally took care of themselves through that modality had a significantly lower risk, like over 70% lower risk of getting the infection. Is there anything like that where being generally healthy matters? Do we know that, you know, that people who are less that eat the standard American diet, for example, are more susceptible to getting Parkinson's disease, or does that even matter?
Yeah, so a Mediterranean diet has been associated with a modestly decreased risk of developing Parkinson's and may have a modestly decreased rate of progression. I think the biggest factor is what you're not eating. So Mediterranean diet is high in fruits and vegetables, low in animal products. And what do animals do? They concentrate these toxins as they move up the food chain. I'll give you an example. A pesticide that have been banned in the United States called heptachlor was used in Hawaii because the Pineapple Growers Association of Hawaii wanted an exemption to use heptachlor on its pineapple crop. And they used it on their pineapple crop. And then the top of the pineapple, the green thing, is called the chop. And then they fed that chop to cows, but they fed it soon after they had harvested the pineapples, and that chop still had heptachlorite in it. And what did the cows do? Well, they concentrated that fat-soluble pesticide in their milk. And then where'd that milk go? Well, it went onto the stores in Hawaii, and then they had a recall of that milk. It turned out at the same time this is all happening, researchers just by coincidence are doing a study of aging, and they find out that high milk consumers in Hawaii had higher rates of Parkinson's disease. They looked in the brains of these individuals. They found fewer dopamine-producing nerve cells in their brain, and they found the residue of the pesticide in the brain of these individuals. So I get really concerned when I like cheese. When I eat cheese, what's in my cheese? I don't want pesticides in my cheese. I don't want the pesticide in the cheese entering in my gut and then causing misfolding of proteins that might affect what's in my brain years or decades later. So I think we need to pay a lot of attention to what we eat. The same thing has been happened for other chemicals, including PCBs. So yeah, I think we should be very concerned about adopting a healthy lifestyle for a whole range of reasons, including brain health.
Okay, so bioaccumulation through animals is a major concern. All right, great. And I think maybe you should watch some of our other speakers on dairy in general. There's some great speakers.
I know they're not going to say good things, but
right. So our next question is coming from Joe W. Please state where you're from and ask your question.
Hello, Doctor. Joe W. from California. Reading online, lead and mercury are associated with tremors. Lead in water is associated with Parkinson's. Mercury is in millions and millions of fillings people have. Question, curious about your comment about that. Also comment, medical establishment is slow to call for the elimination of these things, slow to recognize that they're even dangerous. And other question, amyloid plaque may be caused by ultra-processed, high animal and processed foods. What do you think about that in terms of brain disease?
So I'm going to punt on the amyloid plaque. There'll be probably some Alzheimer's experts who can give you a better answer, but I'll address the heavy metals and the medicine's response. So I think I have a slide on heavy metals that I didn't really touch on. Do I have the heavy metals? Oh, I didn't touch on it. So heavy metals likely play a role in Parkinson's disease. Lead is probably on it. Manganese, another metal that's associated with welding, has been associated with Parkinson's or Parkinson's-like disease. And we mentioned that these heavy metals are found in higher concentration in individuals with Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease. So there are lots of good reasons to limit your exposure to environmental high levels of metals. In medicine, we're too often taught to go from disease to treatment, especially American medicine. If someone's got appendicitis, you take the appendix out. Someone's short of breath, you give them oxygen. Someone's got Parkinson's, you give them medication that replaces the dopamine that's lost. We need to think about going from disease to cause. So when someone has Parkinson's disease, my first question in my mind now is why do they have Parkinson's disease? And I'll give you 3 reasons why that's really important. One, I can't think of any condition that we cure medically where we don't know its cause. So one, there's relatively few conditions that we cure, but if we don't know what its cause is, it's really hard to cure it. I'll give you an example. In the 1980s, bleeding ulcers were a huge cause of death and morbidity in the United States and around the world. I don't know if people remember what ulcers were thought to be due to. Michael, do you remember what they thought ulcers were due to?
I think they said that it was stress, basically,
yes.
that would cause it.
Stress. And so they said you need to change your work, you need to stop working as many hours. It was nonsense, a complete and utter nonsense. If doctors were giving completely the wrong advice, ulcers were due to, Michael, do you recall what ulcers are due to?
A. pylori?
Yeah, a bacteria. So ulcers are due to a bacteria. What was the cure for it? An antibiotics and a cocktail of drugs, and you're cured of ulcers. Almost no one dies of bleeding ulcers in the United States anymore because we found out what its cause is. So if we find out what the cause is of a disease, including things like hepatitis C, which used to be called non-hepatitis A, non-hepatitis B, then we found it's a virus, and now you take a pill and you're cured of hepatitis C. Remarkable advances. But if we don't know what's causing a disease, it's really, really, really hard to cure it. Second, is if you know what's causing a disease, you can reduce your exposure to it. So if you're smoking and you get diagnosed with lung cancer, what's the first thing the doctor's going to tell you to do? Stop smoking. But if you get Parkinson's disease or you get Alzheimer's disease, does the doctor ever tell you to stop getting exposed to air pollution? Do they say to stop getting exposed to pesticides? Do they say stop dry cleaning your clothes with chemicals that are linked to it? I've never heard anyone say that, except maybe me on occasion. Even I only do it on occasion. And then third, and perhaps most powerfully, if you find out what the cause of a disease is you can prevent people from getting it. The response to any crisis, the response to any pandemic is the first thing is to contain it. If you have a fire, you close the doors and you stop fueling it with oxygen. If you have a pandemic, you quarantine people who are infected so other people who aren't affected stay unaffected. We have not done that for Parkinson's disease. We've only added fuel to the fire. We're spraying Paraquat today on fields throughout the United States. In California, perhaps near where you live, Joe, our people are spraying Paraquat in the fields in Central California. And along with spraying Paraquat, I think they're spraying the seeds of future cases of Parkinson's disease. We need to stop fueling the fire so we can reduce the number of people affected by Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, autism, ALS, and many other brain diseases.
Great, thank you. And how is Parkinson's disease diagnosed? Is it symptomatology? Are there specific tests that can be done to say, oh, yep, you have Parkinson's disease?
By and large, it's based on symptoms, and you have two of the following four symptoms. Tremor, usually in the hands, usually asymmetric, worse on one side than the other. Second, slowness of movement. Third is stiffness. And fourth is difficulty with walking or balance. If you have two of those four, you have Parkinsonism. And the most common cause of it, there's some medications that can cause those symptoms, but the most common cause is Parkinson's disease, I think, due to these environmental toxins. Now, there's some research. We've had a fancy imaging test that can help tell whether someone has a Parkinsonian disorder, so that's available. Really recent research suggesting that you can find this misfolded protein in the skin of individuals. I kind of glossed over it, but if you have some astute viewers, which I know you do, we're not sure what role skin exposure to these toxicants, including, pesticides, for example, including dry cleaning chemicals that people who might work with it, what role they might play in Parkinson's disease. I get really concerned about what role skin exposure, for example, to pesticides might be playing in ALS. For example, studies in Italy, Scotland, and Spain have all linked soccer playing to different brain diseases, including ALS. And so as some people know that the nerve cells that innervate the muscle that's right underneath the skin is affected in ALS. So I get really concerned about what skin exposure might be. But it turns out skin might be a skin test might be a powerful way of diagnosing Parkinson's disease.
And when we see someone with Parkinson's disease, obviously they have a hard time moving around. What is the cognitive impact? Does it impair any sort of intellectual or cognitive functions?
So by and large, for most people with Parkinson's disease, especially if it begins in the nose, if it's through inhaled, significant cognitive impairment is a later manifestation of disease. But after 5, 10, 15 years, people do get cognitive impairment. If the disease is beginning in the gut, many people get something called dementia with Lewy bodies. Robin Williams, for example, had this dementia with Lewy bodies. And there you're getting it spreading usually along nerve pathways on both sides of the body because the gut receives innervation from the right side and the left side of the spinal cord and the brain. And so it's likely spreading up both hemispheres. And when you spread up into both hemispheres, you're more likely to get dementia. And so people who are getting exposure through toxins that they're ingesting may be more prone to dementia with Lewy bodies and have more significant cognitive impairment than those who don't.
Great. Next question is coming from Stephen V. Please state where you're from and ask your question.
Buffalo, New York. What do you think about, we had the fires last year in Canada. We had a lot of particulate matter. What do you think about that as a problem? And what do you think about, the home air purifiers as a mitigating strategy?
Well, I thought a lot about it because I like to bike and I like to be outside. And, what's a great way to be healthy is to spend a lot of time outside. So I was wearing my N95 mask last summer, not because of COVID, but because when I was biking to work, I didn't want to be breathing in the toxic air that we breathe in Rochester and Buffalo and in New York City and many other cities throughout North America. My parents live in Southern California. So 2 years ago, our children bought their grandparents air purifiers for their homes. So I think these air purifiers can reduce exposure to particulate matter. And if I lived in a part of the country that had high levels of air pollution, or part of the world that had high levels of air pollution, which is really concerning, I would think about an air purifier.
Great. Thank you. And what are early signs of Parkinson's disease that should concern someone enough that they should go get themselves checked? And does catching Parkinson's disease early have an impact on mitigating the presentation and the further worsening of the disease?
So we really haven't studied that second question really well, but early symptoms of disease, as I alluded to, some Parkinson's begins in the gut. So one of the earliest features of the disease is constipation, which can precede the development of tremor by years, if not decades. So obviously I don't want anyone who's got constipated to think that Parkinson's disease is the reason. That's not the top 1, 2, or 3 reasons, but that can be an early feature of the disease. Disturbances in sleep, something called REM sleep behavior disorder. So normally when we're dreaming during REM sleep, we're getting chased by the lion, for example, we're paralyzed during that time. People who have REM sleep behavior disorder, which is very common as a prodromal feature of Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease, tend to act out those dreams. So they might strike their bed partner. So if your bed partner is acting out their dreams consistently, that's another early concerning feature of Parkinson's or other neurodegenerative diseases. Turns out loss of smell. Parkinson's disease begins in many cases with pathology in the smell centers of our brain. Alzheimer's disease, likewise. I think air pollution is playing a big role in both those diseases. So loss of smell, again, often precedes the tremor and slowness of movement and the memory disturbance by years, if not decades. So early loss of smell, not from COVID, but from other factors, would be concerning.
And what is the current treatment for Parkinson's disease, and what are the limitations of the treatments?
So I think the number one thing is to stop exposure to these toxins. So if I had these symptoms, if I had a loss of smell, if I had a history of exposure to well water, if I had a history of exposure working with this chemical trichloroethylene, I would be really, really vigilant about my exposure to these chemicals. So I told you about organic. Our yard, that we don't use pesticides in our yard. We have lots of dandelions. I'd much rather have dandelions than Parkinson's disease. So I would be really, really vigilant about exposure to toxicants in my environment.
And but are there medications that we can take?
Oh yeah, medication. Yeah. So the second thing I would do is exercise. So exercise is really beneficial for people with Parkinson's disease. And it turns out that vigorous exercise, the equivalent to 3.5 to 4 hours of exercise in your 40s, 50s, can decrease your risk of associated with a 20% decreased risk of ever developing the disease. So these are all those modifiers I was talking about. So I think modifying it with exercise and diet. And then the most effective medication for Parkinson's disease is a medication called levodopa, which is really effective. It's a miracle drug when it was created in the 1960s and 70s, and alleviates many of the symptoms with Parkinson's disease. And then for some individuals, there are surgical treatments, including something called deep brain stimulation, which in the right individuals can be of great benefit.
And you said 3.5 to 4 hours. Is that per week?
Per week, yes. And so that's the equivalent of like running or swimming.
Okay, great. And are there any new treatments on the horizon that give not the medical industry, who has a motive of raking in money, but give you hope for the future of patients with Parkinson's disease?
Just like on the medication front, just like an insulin pump has made people's lives with diabetes much better, there are likely to be levodopa pumps that are coming that pump the medication into your skin. In full disclosure, I've done some consulting for a company that's developing it. There are some therapies that are targeting the underlying genetic mutations that are contribute to Parkinson's disease. Unfortunately, only a small number of people have these genetic mutations, but it turns out that trichloroethylene and this mutation LARC2 both increase the activity of this protein called LARC2. And so it may turn out that environmental toxicants are acting through similar mechanisms that genetic mutations lead to Parkinson's disease. So that environmental and genetic causes may be acting through common pathways, in which case drugs that are targeting these common pathways could be a benefit not only for people with genetic cause of the disease, but people with environmental causes as well. I think those are two areas that are promising. I'll just point out, we're spending a lot of time and energy trying to cure a preventable disease. Out of every Parkinson's research dollar, only 2 cents goes to preventing the disease. Out of every Parkinson's research dollar, only 2 cents goes to preventing what is likely a preventable disease. If we don't change our actions there, we're going to be chasing our tails. Just like if you were running an auto shop and everyone coming in with flat tires, it's important to change those flat tires. But at some point in time, someone needs to say, what's wrong with the roads? And we need, with Parkinson's, to devote a lot more time and energy to figuring out what's wrong with our roads, or in this case, what's wrong with the environment, so we can prevent people from ever developing this debilitating and deadly disease.
And is there any hope that it can be reversed? Has there been any examples of people who were presenting with obviously, I guess, classic characteristics of Parkinson's disease and then reverse that disease? Are those
Not
symptoms?
to my knowledge, but I'll tell you, there have been case reports. So these are single cases, so lots of grains of salt, that showed a woman was working with pesticides and was starting to develop weakness in her hands. I think it was in her hands. And when she stopped the occupational exposure to the pesticides, the weakness in her hands went away. And, make you think, could ALS in the very, very earliest stages of the disease, could these things be reversible? And so if you think about it, you would think at some point in time, things go from progressive to, a period of time where you could intervene. Some of my colleagues are spending a lot of their time trying to identify people at high risk for developing Parkinson's, through sophisticated imaging or other testing, and then to introduce, many of them introduce, either exercise or medications to prevent people from at high risk from ever developing the disease. But I think, we really need to take an approach that Real Truth About Health, is about preventing the disease in the first place. I don't want to be cured of prostate cancer. I don't want impotence. I don't want incontinence. I just never want to get prostate cancer. And if we take it away, if we look at many of these brain diseases as preventable, which I think they are, we can live in a world that's largely free of them and all live longer, healthier, and more productive and more independent lives.
So point taken on prevention over cure, but I do have some questions that I'm going to be asking on once someone has it. And I mentioned, I asked you about diet as a preventative measure, but has diet shown any promise for slowing the progress, mitigating the expression of the disease?
Yeah, so some studies have suggested the Mediterranean diet may be beneficial for individuals who already have the disease. One of the problems with Parkinson's disease is that we're really terrible at measuring disease progression. And we do that by having people tap their thumb and index finger really fast and having someone like me rate that on a scale that goes from 0 to 4 with a subjective measure that's categorical and insensitive to change. So our ability to assess and determine whether certain interventions, whether it's diet, exercise, or other changes in our lifestyle, are beneficial is limited because of our insensitivity of these measures. But that said, there's really good evidence that exercise is beneficial for people with Parkinson's disease. There's modest evidence for that exercise is beneficial for individuals. I mean, that a Mediterranean diet is beneficial. I think intellectually that there's powerful evidence that limiting your exposure to these toxicants would be helpful. There have been studies that have linked high levels of air pollution to an increased risk of hospitalization among individuals with Parkinson's disease. So I think if I had Parkinson's disease, I'd give a lot of thought to where I live if I had the means to do so, which is a small portion of the population. But I think there are things that we can do to limit our exposure to these. If I had a Parkinson's disease and I didn't want to get Alzheimer's disease or I didn't want to get cognitive impairment, I would be especially interested in breathing in clean air and might make determinations where I live around that.
I have a feeling that you caused half of the audience to be going like this. I know that I was doing that.
I thought you were going to say that half the audience was going to be paying attention to the air that they're breathing, but
I think to the extent that we have control, this is the audience that will go the extra mile to prevent themselves from getting sick. This is definitely a proactive audience. So this is definitely, I think, your crowd.
And I think that, I think this audience might get ridiculed or, I don't know, looked down upon it at sometimes. But, it is the people who are at the leading edge who change the course of society. Now, sometimes people are wrong who are the leading edge and they get it wrong. But it's people like who are radical, who are a little bit more motivated, who like look at the world a little bit differently, who don't buy into the biomedical healthcare industry complex. I mean, think about it. You know, I think I'm a relatively young guy, but 25 years ago when I was in medical school, life expectancy was higher than it is today. So life expectancy in the United States was higher when I was in medical school 25 years ago, and we spend 50% more on healthcare today than we did when I was in medical school. So clearly something is wrong. The answer to this is not spending more on doctors and hospitals to get healthier. The answer is to address the factors that are our environment and to change the course of these diseases for all of us.
So I appreciate that. So is there any way, to your knowledge, to detoxify these toxins from our fatty tissue?
I mentioned the chelation therapy attempt, which, you know, is an approach that's used for another brain disease called Wilson's disease, which is due to high levels of copper in the brain, the liver, and that there it works. In Parkinson's, it hasn't worked to date. Getting it out of the fat, I haven't seen anything. I get concerned, you know, if I were a woman, I'd be really upset. I'm not a woman and I'm upset, but if I were a woman, I'd be really upset that the fact that I have pesticide levels in my fat and then I'm passing that on to my child when I'm nursing. I mean, that to me is unacceptable and something that we should find as a society wholly unacceptable and something that we should be seeking to change. You know, why are we giving children lower IQs to start? You know, not only is that bad for them, it's bad for us. You know, it's not good for our society to be becoming dumber over time, less intelligent over time. I don't know if that's indeed the fact, but there are certainly children, as Dr. Rao's research has suggested, and that of others, that are showing that these nerve toxins, these pesticides, many of which are impairing our intellectual ability, and this is beginning at a very young age.
Yeah, and even as a father, obviously, same thing. You know, the transmissibility between the mother and the child, you know, affecting my children is very upsetting. You know, the world's hard enough without having that as a hurdle. How do you address skepticism towards environmental causes of Parkinson's disease in the scientific community?
There's a great book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. It's written by Thomas Kuhn in the 1960s. And Thomas Kuhn was a physicist. He was a professor at Harvard, and he was increasingly interested in the history of science as opposed to science itself. He was interested in like the question, why did we have an Earth-centric model of the universe for so long when it was clear that there were anomalies that the Earth-centric model wasn't accounting for, wasn't addressing. Harvard didn't like his approach to research, so they denied him tenure, and so he went to Berkeley and wrote the most influential book in the history of science called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And this is where the term paradigm shift, many of you listeners will know about that. That's where that came from Thomas Kuhn. And he said that the science seeks to answer puzzles. And by definition, puzzles have answers. So scientists are loath to answer questions for which they don't have the adequate tools or that for which they're not going to find an answer. So scientists love genetics in this era. The paradigm of 2024 and biomedical research is that genetics is the underpinning of most diseases when in fact it's not, especially common diseases. And it's important for cystic fibrosis, Huntington's disease, wide range of rare, relatively rare, but for common diseases, genetics are a relatively small factor. But we have really, really, really powerful tools to identify if someone's got a genetic risk factor. We can sequence their whole genome and find out if there's a genetic mutation. But the vast majority of Parkinson's disease, people with Parkinson's have no identifiable genetic risk factor. So what to do? And people go, well, then it's just aging. We're all getting older. Well, people 200 years ago weren't old. But in fact, people 200 years ago were old. There were old people. George Washington was 60s. John Adams was 90. Thomas Jefferson was 84. There were lots and lots of old people, and they weren't developing Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease as far as we could tell. So I think it's really hard to change this paradigm. Thomas Kuhn in his book quotes Charles Darwin and Max Planck, the physicist. Charles Darwin, as many of your listeners know, was really reluctant to publish The Origin of Species because he knew his colleagues weren't going to accept it. And he said, why would they accept this different way of thinking when everything they've been trained and taught is anathema to this approach? And so he had no thought of convincing his current colleagues. In fact, he only published it because he was going to get scooped by another scientist at the time. Max Planck was more blunt. The physicist said the only way new ideas take root is when the old guard dies off. So I spent a lot of my time trying to get out to the public and people like listening to Real Truth on Health because they're more open, I think, to these ideas. I think the younger generation more readily appreciates that our environment dictates our health. That's not an anthem to them. The fact that toxins and pesticides might be contributing to intellectual disabilities would be a natural way of thinking if you're probably under 30. So we just need these individuals, these ideas, the youth and people like here to increasingly make their voices heard, to have our politicians response and representatives respond to these interests so we can all live longer and healthier lives.
And how have you found the reception of your message to your colleagues and to the audiences that you strategically speak to?
So even my co-authors, my fellow authors, they were skeptical of me when I was writing it. Todd Scherer did research 20 years ago linking pesticide to Parkinson's disease. He did this with Tim Greenemeyer, a very smart Parkinson's specialist at the University of Pittsburgh. It turns out that Dr. Tim Greenemeyer recently disclosed that he developed Parkinson's disease, possibly related to the research that he was doing studying these pesticides that he linked to Parkinson's. So he himself did the experiment on himself and developed Parkinson's disease. Dr. Bas Bloom, he went along with what I was saying, but now he's even more radical than I am. So he's leading the charge in Europe against pesticides. I think it's taking root. It's really, really slow. The younger generation, I think, is more open to these ideas. But again, it's just never taught. Even I didn't know this stuff. I was trained at all the top institutions in the country. And until I took a sabbatical 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I was only vaguely aware of pesticides' role in Parkinson's disease and really knew nothing about trichloroethylene until Dr. Caroline Tanner said, "Do you know about Camp Lejeune?" And I had no idea about Camp Lejeune. But the last 5, 6 years, the more I investigate, the more I find, the more concerned I get. As a scientist, or anyone, you do research, and most of the times you end in a blind alley. It just ends. This just keeps spreading and spreading. And although I'm a Parkinson's specialist, I keep reading about these chemicals, these toxins in our food, water, and air, and I keep coming across other diseases. I come across ALS, I come across Alzheimer's, I come across autism, I come across intellectual disabilities, I come across brain cancer. And so I get more and more concerned about the effects of these things, not just for Parkinson's, which is obviously my passion, but for a wide range of brain diseases. And it's worth recognizing that brain diseases today are the world's leading source of disability. We have more disability in the world from brain diseases than we do from cancer, more than heart disease, more than COVID, more than infectious diseases is brain diseases.
So is that, just to make the distinction, that's disability, not necessarily death?
Yeah,
correct?
so it's the second leading cause of death. I think heart disease is still the leading cause of death in the world. Brain disease is number 2. But in terms of disability, which is, most people probably care even more about disability than death, brain disease is our leading source of disability in the world.
So no, that's in the world, not in the United States, right? Because I think cancer in the United States is number
I don't know what it is in the United States.
but worldwide, it's
Worldwide, it's brain diseases. Think about stroke. These are all, we know stroke is preventable. I mean, that's like, and the incidence of stroke is falling in the United States because we're controlling hypertension, because we control high cholesterol, because we have medications, and people are waking up to the effects of lifestyle modifications that they can do to lower the risk of ever developing a stroke.
And you're a clinician, correct?
Yeah, I'm a neurologist. Yeah.
So, what do you? I assume that patients seek you out. Especially you had the book out there. What are the people who seek you out hope to get from going to see you? Given that so much of your book and your focus is on prevention, which is too late if they already have Parkinson's disease. What are they hoping for, and what protocols do you invoke with your patients?
I don't think most people know about the prevention in Parkinson's, so it's not like they're coming down Dorsey's this guy talking about the environmental causes of Parkinson's disease. Even Paraquat, which I don't know if you heard about Paraquat.
Only through you. Although is Paraquat the stuff that they say to put on your shoes and leave it for a day by itself, and then it protects you from ticks?
No. So Paraquat was also sprayed. The cultural reference was as part of the war on drugs. Nixon sprayed Paraquat on marijuana fields in Mexico and then in Georgia. And so in The Big Lebowski, there's a reference that the Paraquat marijuana Paraquat tainted marijuana was making its way in Southern California, and Jeff Bridges says, "Don't be such a quat." But even when I go to farmers, they're unaware of it. As I mentioned, I think a lot of the chemical companies, we know, according to reporting from The Guardian, have deliberately sowed the seeds of doubt and sowed the seeds of ignorance. So I think most people are just widely ignorant of these issues, just like I was widely ignorant of it. If I'm trained at Penn and Stanford and I'm ignorant, what's the person who's not had such a privileged education going to have? So I think the vast majority of people are still ignorant of it. I do talk about it, the prevention, because I think modifying these risk factors could modify the disease course for people already with the disease. And then I think people are concerned about their children. And so we know people with Parkinson's have their children are at 2 to 4 times higher risk of developing the disease. So, figuring out what the cause is for them, I think has a lot of implications for their children and for their other family members.
Okay, I'm going to throw a question out to the audience. Rita B, please state where you're from and ask your question. Rita?
Hi, this is Rita, and I am from Long Island. Thank you for the information, Dr. Dorsey. I want to mention something as far as I have been hearing the several lectures, and everybody keeps talking about the detox. So I want to mention to you, if you can look into that, there is a Quicksilver scientific advanced push catch system by Dr. Shedd, and that is fabulous, and it is known to reduce heavy metals, molds, and environmental toxin. And actually, Dr. David Perlmutter had introduced me to him when we were, going around the exhibit booth, and he was at the booth. And this is a liposomal system. And a lot of people and a lot of functional medicine practitioners have been using it. So I'm requesting you to please look into that. So the more people will know, at least, everybody is not going to go for the chelation and all, but this may be the better and simple way to do it. This is my request.
Rita, if you can type that into the chat also, just so people can read it.
Sure.
So, you spoke a little bit about chelation, and possibly detoxing may be dangerous in and of itself because you're bringing these chemicals back in, through your system. Is that correct?
Well, it's just an empirical finding that in this study published in the New England Journal of Medicine, they gave an iron chelator. It lowered the levels of iron in the brain, but people got worse, much worse.
So what are your thoughts on what Rita was saying as far as are there any hopes for pulling this stuff out of your body without making yourself sicker? I mean, it's great that your blood looks great, that your that your levels look great, but if you're sicker than you would have been had you left it there, it's like I think McKinley was shot with a bullet and he died not of the bullet but of the attempts to remove the bullet, right?
Yeah. So I'm a researcher, and so I love evidence, and so that's what I love to see. And so I think you can have hypotheses, and and it's worth pursuing those hypotheses, and then we need to test them. And the nice thing is we can do clinical trials to test out whether these interventions are beneficial or not. So we, for example, we thought vitamin E and antioxidant might be helpful when Parkinson's, so we studied it not to be helpful. We thought coenzyme Q10 in early studies, and another antioxidant shown to be promising in early trials, but in a larger scale clinical trial not. I think for some of these things is that the metals or the injury could have happened in childhood, as we were saying, and so the process has been playing out. So if you go back and try to address the initial event 30 years later, it just might be too late. But doesn't mean that we shouldn't be studying these things and looking for alternatives to do it. But again, I think we're spending a tremendous amount of time and energy trying to cure a preventable disease. We don't cure polio. We don't cure COVID. We don't cure HIV. There's only been 3 people in the history of the world ever cured with HIV. But, HIV might disappear as a major clinical entity in our lifetimes because of people like Larry Kramer and because we're preventing the disease. And we're even giving, in some cases, medications to reduce the risk of transmission. If we can get rid of HIV in our lifetime without curing it, it really speaks to the power of prevention. I mean, look at COVID. We don't cure COVID. We don't cure polio. We don't cure lots of things. But we don't cure smallpox, but we just don't have these diseases because we've gotten rid of them.
And are you seeing anything on a governmental level that gives you hope either in the United States or any country that may be an example of a paradigm for how to handle this?
Yeah, so you look at Europe, and I alluded to the study in the Netherlands. The rates of Parkinson's are growing least rapidly, in fact, plateauing in Europe, where we have clean air regulations around pesticides, although they have gaps too, and much less use of this dry cleaning chemical trichloroethylene. The United States, the EPA, Dr. Michael Friedhoff and colleagues proposed a ban on trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene last year. That proposal hasn't been implemented yet, but that's promising. The EPA got rid of chlorpyrifos, banned that pesticide that's on apples that's causing intellectual disabilities, likely in children, widely used on golf courses, used on utility poles. But its manufacturer sued in court, and the court sent it back to the EPA to be reevaluated. So you can see that there are interests that are allowing these chemicals to remain in our environment in increasing numbers. Paraquats from 1960s. No one listening here would fly in an airplane from the 1960s. If engineers can develop safer airplanes, then chemists, American chemists are smart. They can develop smarter, safer chemicals for enhancing our food production. So there are lots of things that we can do as a society to address it. We're starting to do some things around the edges, but we need to do vastly more.
So you mentioned golfers or golf courses a couple of times. Do golfers have a higher rate of Parkinson's disease? One thing that I think we find is that when things happen to disadvantaged people, nothing, there's no real pushback to it. But when things happen to wealthier people, which obviously golfers are going to be disproportionately wealthy than the general population, are these people suffering from Parkinson's disease at a higher rate? So
no one's done that study that I know about. I'm going to tell you a couple vignettes. One in the Annals of Neurology, one of the top neurology journals, two researchers reported a cluster of Parkinson's disease around a golf course, 18 people, as I recall, with Parkinson's who all lived around the golf course, and 15 of them lived downwind of the golf course. So you can imagine these pesticides are being sprayed, as I indicated before. Individuals, many of these toxins are inhaled, and those might be the most potent ways of getting Parkinson's is entry through the nose. The nose might be the front door of the brain. There was also a study, I think, done in the 1990s, but in the 20th century, looking at superintendents of golf courses. It's something like the Superintendents Golf Course Association of America or something like that. And there they found high rates of brain diseases in these individuals. I think the size was too small to see if there was statistical significance for Parkinson's disease, but as I recall, there was like twice as many people with Parkinson's disease among golf course superintendents. So there are lots of these clues. I mentioned that there are studies that found that green space workers are at higher risk of ALS. Green space workers are at higher risk of Parkinson's disease. Farmers are clearly at higher risk of Parkinson's disease, especially farmers who work with Paraquat. But even people who simply live near where Paraquat is being sprayed, research by Dr. Bieta Ritz at UCLA has shown that individuals who live near where these pesticides are being sprayed, they're not farmers themselves, are at higher risk of developing Parkinson's disease.
And do these toxic chemicals naturally clear themselves from the environment? Are there ways that you're aware of to remediate an area that has been exposed to this? Or are these Chernobyl, chemical versions of Chernobyl where they're just dead zones for centuries potentially?
So I'm a neurologist, I'm not an environmental scientist, but many of these things are really slow to decay in the environment. So trichloroethylene, its half-life is an order of 5 to 10 years or something of that order of magnitude. So they're really slow. There have been studies that have been looked at feeding bacteria into polluted water or the like to see if that can work. For trichloroethylene, the one, the chemical that evaporates from groundwater and soil, there's a nice remediation system, just like people have radon remediation systems in their homes to prevent them from radon from entering their homes. You can have that same remediation system, can be really beneficial to prevent people from getting exposure to TCE in their homes, schools, and workplaces. And those things are called sub-slab depressurization systems, are in place in lots of places. And they should be in place, I think, in Newport Beach, California, where I went to high school, in these homes that have it, because that could decrease the risk. I'd much rather have that than an air purifier that's competing for the competing for breathing in this chemical with my kids' lungs. To me, that's craziness. But so I think there are ways to remediate and ways to mitigate exposure.
So you introduced us to, or many of us to a great word, agnotology, the intentional cause of ignorance and confusion on a particular matter. What are the tactics of the industry in their attempt to keep the public ignorant, and what are common misperceptions or misconceptions because of that?
So this is according to The Guardian, the chemical company for Paraquat has a SWAT team that observes any research that comes out, seeks to discredit researchers. So my colleague, Dr. Debbie Torrey-Slechta, works across the street in that building. And she was nominated to serve on an EPA advisory committee. According to reporting for The Guardian, the company hired a third-party lobbying firm to lobby the EPA to prevent her from serving on that advisory panel, and was successful in doing so. The company companies widely introduce things into the literature that are incomplete or inaccurate, or you can imagine doing a study to see if golfers are at higher risk of Parkinson's would be really hard to do so. But if you just studied a small number of golfers, that's one way to be sure that your study can come to the conclusion that it's not associated with an increased risk. Or if you only studied golfers for 2 years after they stopped playing, that would be another way to demonstrate that it is. So there are lots of ways that you can set up your study to bias you to finding a null result. It's really hard to get a positive result, like everything's stacked against you. So when you find a positive result, you need to pay attention. Companies, I'll tell you what else. I wrote a paper on Paraquat, Parkinson's, and agnotology. My reward for doing so was having someone knock on my door, ask my son if I was home so that they could issue me a subpoena. So we should be looking at what these chemical companies are doing, why they're hiring the same law firms that defended big tobacco, that are now defending chemical companies that are seeking to introduce products into our environment that are known, if not clearly associated with Parkinson's disease, and why they're getting a free ride on this. We need to hold wrongdoers accountable. Those wrongdoers include the big tobacco executives who went to Congress and swore to tell the truth and nothing but the truth in the 1990s and did anything but it. Why aren't these people being held accountable? Why aren't some people being sent to jail for their actions? If we hold wrongdoers accountable, they will change their behavior. If we do not hold wrongdoers accountable, they will only become emboldened. We were fooled on tobacco. We were fooled on the opioid pandemic. We're being less fooled on social media. We should be less fooled on pesticides. We should be less fooled on dry cleaning chemicals. We should be less fooled on air pollution. We should be less fooled on climate change. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. We know what they're up to. They follow exactly the same script. They hire exactly the same lawyers. They've hired exactly the same experts. They hire the same firms to do the same studies to cast doubt on any product. They'll do the same thing. They'll tell you that smoking doesn't cause lung cancer today if they could, and they do. We need to be really, really, really vigilant and hold wrongdoers accountable. There's no reason that we should be subsidizing the cost of Parkinson's disease. As a society, we spend $25 billion through Medicare caring for over 1 million Medicare beneficiaries with Parkinson's disease. We spend $25 billion so a company like that manufactures Paraquat can make $400 million in revenue. Why are we subsidizing the cost of the chemical companies? Why are we doing that monetarily? And why are we doing that with our children? Why are we doing that with our seniors? Why are we doing that with our adults? We need to hold wrongdoers accountable.
Have you seen any successful pushbacks of anything analogous to this? So not necessarily with Parkinson's disease, but let's say the smoking in the tobacco companies in the 90s. Have you seen anything that you're saying, oh, that's the model for how to handle this situation?
Well, yeah, the tobacco companies end up paying billions of dollars. Asbestos manufacturers have paid billions of dollars. The U.S. government is going to pay billions of dollars to care for the Marines that they knowingly exposed to trichloroethylene in their drinking water. The Marines refused to even notify the Marines that they exposed to these chemicals after the fact so they could get cancer screened. It took congressional action and a really, 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 really pissed off Marine, Jerry Insminger, whose daughter died from leukemia, to change the course of Camp Lejeune and to bring justice for the million Marines, their families, and civilians who were knowingly exposed to trichloroethylene for 25 years at Camp Lejeune. When we do that, we can change behavior. The Marines aren't going to be using trichloroethylene anymore, or their use will be shortly curtailed because of being held accountable. Marines will think twice about knowingly exposing 20-year-olds, the best and brightest among us, to toxins when they know the story of Camp Lejeune. If we hold wrongdoers accountable, we change the behavior and we all benefit from it. When we don't, we only embolden wrongdoers to continue to push the envelope, to continue to do more and more actions and see how far they can get away with it. We need to hold all wrongdoers accountable through all elements of society.
And are you familiar with there's a new chemical being used on produce to help preserve it so that way it can be more shelf stable? It's called Appeal. Are you familiar with that?
No, but there's something called the precautionary principle. So in the United States, for a drug to be approved, it needs to be shown to be safe and effective. We should adopt that same principle for new products, to make produce last longer on shelves. If it shows to be safe and effective, fine, have it. But right now we put the onus on people to show that these chemicals are harmful instead of the onus on chemical companies to show that their products are beneficial. We do it for drugs. We require the drugs to be safe and effective before they're approved. We should do the exact same thing for chemicals. We should stop giving the benefit of the doubt to chemicals and start giving the benefit of the doubt to people.
Thank you. Our next question is coming from Stephen V. Please ask your question, Stephen.
Yeah. Do you eat exclusively organic, and do you filter your water? And if so, what do you use?
So I read Fast Food Nation, so that made me give up meat, and then I wrote our book, and then that gave me give up pesticides. So I don't do it in all places. If I go to a restaurant, I eat whatever they have, but where I make the decisions about buying things, I try to buy organic. And then I do add a water filter. I think I have a pure water filter. I have no financial relationships to Pure. I have a pure water filter on my water at home, my faucet at home. So when I drink water, I use that as my source. And then I wash all my fruits and vegetables, even the organics ones, with water and a vegetable wash.
And are you familiar with any studies or any research on which water filters work best? And what are we trying to filter out? What in our water, what should we, because I'm assuming all the chemicals you mentioned, but what should we be watching for with regard to?
So I'm not an engineer, so I would be cautious to take this with several grains of salt. So it appears that carbon filters are pretty good at getting rid of pesticides, pretty good at ridding trichloroethylene, and pretty getting rid of like forever chemicals. But I'm not an expert in this, and I haven't done a deep dive on this. Maybe some of your other lecturers will tell, and I'll learn from them.
All right, great.
But I would test, if I got a well, I would test my well. We had a well in Maryland, up to 40 million Americans get their water from a well. So if I had a well, I would test it, and I would make sure, usually testing is only often just done for bacteria, which is fine, but you need also be tested for pesticides if you're in rural areas, and these chemicals if you live in urban or suburban areas.
And so a lot of speakers refer to the Environmental Working Group. They have some stuff on water. Although even with them, their information comes from the municipalities. They don't do their own research, but ewg.org is something that's interesting to check out.
And Ken Cook, their president and CEO, is going to be speaking at our symposium on the brain and the environment May 20th in Washington, D.C.
Oh, that's really interesting. Ken Cook is his name?
Yeah.
So you mentioned organic. How reliable, based on, and I don't know if you've done any research on this, but how reliable is the organic label at preventing people from being exposed to these types of chemicals?
So again, I'm not a farmer, I'm not an agricultural expert, but I had the naive assumption that organic meant that there were no pesticides on it. And it turned out that there are pesticide residues on organic produce. We talk a little bit about that in our book, Ending Parkinson's Disease. That's why I wash my organic produce with water and a vegetable wash. It turns out, my understanding is that in many cases, organic produce is grown right next to conventional produce. So you can imagine that there's drift of pesticides that are being sprayed on conventional produce and that can contaminate or organic produce. In some of these cases, something called regulatory capture, whereby industry gains control of the regulatory agencies that are supposed to be regulating it. And I think, in food production, some people say in pharmaceuticals, people have varying views on this, but that we're at risk of regulatory capture in some of these industries, and that the rules are being written for the benefits of the companies as opposed to for the benefits of the public.
Great, thank you. And do we fully understand the mechanism for how these chemicals cause or at least contribute to Parkinson's disease?
Yeah, we're learning. So your brain is only about 3% of your body mass, but it consumes 20% of your glucose or energy. So it's a gas guzzling machine. And those dopamine producing nerve cells in your brain, they have a million different connections. And if you stretched them out, they would be 4 meters in length. So I'm a really tall guy, so they'd be twice my height. And they're not insulated, they're not myelinated. So they have huge energy demands. And because of these huge energy demands, they are chock full of mitochondria, which are the energy producing parts of cells. One of my colleagues said, think of them as a big garbage bag filled with jelly beans, and those jelly beans are mitochondria. Turns out that Paraquat, trichloroethylene, and air pollution all damage mitochondria. And so I think for many brain diseases, that these toxins in our environment that damage the energy producing parts of cells, or the parts of cells that are responsible for recycling the mitochondria. Nerve cells, the nerve cells you were born with, largely you stay with your whole life, as opposed to a skin cell, which, you can slough off and you get another skin cell. You don't get another cell, generally speaking, in your brain or in certain parts of your brain and your periphery. I'm hedging here because this active area of research. So you have to recirculate and recycle your energy producing parts of cells. So these toxins either damage the energy producing parts of cells, mitochondria, or the mechanisms by which these mitochondria are recycled. And that's likely how they contribute to misfolding of a protein. But all of that is a little bit, A, one, beyond my comprehension, and B, an area of active investigation.
So, I know when I was growing up, we were taught that brain cells can't regenerate, and then all of a sudden neuroplasticity became a very big thing, and the idea that we can actually, that our brains don't just, aren't just with us when we're born and die off. So are you saying that there are certain parts of the brain where the cells you're born with are the cells that you die with, essentially?
Yeah. Like, the nerves that go, like your sciatic nerve doesn't get replaced. Like, you cut your sciatic nerve, it doesn't grow back. Small little pieces, can grow back and things, but, many of the nerve cells you have and you grow with are the ones that you're going to die with. So treat them well.
And you mentioned that trichloroethylene, TCE, yes, that's so much easier to say. TCE is or was used for decaf coffee or decaffeinating coffee. Is that still in use?
So the FDA in, I think, 1977, the 1970s, banned the use of trichloroethylene for decaffeinating coffee. So you should not be drinking trichloroethylene for your coffee, but it was.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that as a decaf. And do you have any unique protocols, or what protocols do you end up using for your patients with regard to Parkinson's disease?
I probably pay a little bit more attention than my colleagues to these environmental risk factors, but there's no Dorsey protocol or anything like that that we do. We try to meet the needs of patients and treat them as best as we can, and let them live as, people with Parkinson's can live highly productive lives, especially the first years of diagnosis. Michael J. Fox has written 3 books, starred in 2 different TV shows, won multiple, I think, Emmys, at least 1 Emmys since developing Parkinson's disease. We've had an attorney general have Parkinson's disease. We've had a pope have Parkinson's disease. We've had congressmen and senators have Parkinson's disease. Actors and lots and lots of people live highly productive lives with Parkinson's disease, and we try to do the best we can to enable that to be the case for the patients we care for.
So I think one of the most famous people who had Parkinson's disease was Muhammad Ali. Can you explain how he got Parkinson's disease and is it, I mean, is it really the same disease as these chemical caused ones, or does it have just similar symptoms that?
I think Dr. Oken, one of the co-authors, had an article published. He was part of the team that cared for Muhammad Ali. This was published with after his death and with permission of his family. So there are multiple things, just like breast cancer isn't just due to one thing, and lung cancer, as we alluded to, has many different causes, and Parkinson's has many different causes. You know, some get it from pesticides, likely, some get it from trichloroethylene, likely, some get it from air pollution, some get it from some interaction thereof. And so head trauma is another major risk factor for Parkinson's disease, and head trauma was likely a factor, according to Dr. Oken, in the development of Parkinson's disease for Muhammad Ali.
So do we see, I assume that means that we see higher rates of Parkinson's disease in football players and in boxers, and I assume with the, you know, this mixed martial arts that's become so popular?
Yeah, I'm like, it concerns me. Like, I think it's kind of self-evident that if you get concussions, that's not good for your brain, yet we seem to be encouraging sports and developing sports that seem to be increasing concussions. I think that's concerning. There was a great study published in JAMA maybe 5-10 years ago, looked at 203 NFL football players, or maybe 199 football players, you know, something like 200 NFL football players, and 99% of them, all but one, I think, had evidence of chronic traumatic encephalopathy in them. And I think about 40% of those individuals had symptoms of Parkinson's or Parkinson-like disease. So I think there's really strong evidence that repeated head trauma is not good for your health. There are even women's soccer players, Michelle Akers, Brandy Chastain, you know, won the Women's World Cup, I think in 1996 in Los Angeles, defeating China. And they're looking back and saying to themselves, you know, maybe heading a ball that's coming down from 50 feet wasn't the best idea in the world. So I think there are things that we can do to modify the sports that we love to decrease our risk of developing head trauma. And I don't think we're doing nearly enough to doing so. I don't think we're doing nearly enough for children. And I think we should think about ourselves in terms of what values what we're demanding in our preferences for the sports that we watch. You know, I feel guilty watching the NFL, you know, in part because of the concerns around head trauma.
Yeah, and I hear you. I'm actually looking forward to Mike Tyson's next fight, and you know, and I love the guy. I understand his imperfections, but and I recognize that, you know, obviously it may not end up well for him. So we've got a little bit less than a minute. What gives you hope with what's going on this issue?
We've done this before. We've gotten rid of polio. We've made drinking, driving socially unacceptable. We're in our lifetime. I think HIV is going to disappear as a major clinical entity when that was completely inconceivable when I was in medical training. You know, all my medical training was preparing me to care for people with HIV. We developed protease inhibitors and condoms. And, you know, HIV, you know, disappeared in large part from the hospital, still a major public health issue. If we take action, if we recognize that we've received gifts from the previous generations, if we end our silence around Parkinson's disease, if we end our silence around autism, if we end our silence around Alzheimer's disease, if we stop viewing these diseases as natural consequences of aging, which they're not. You put the mice in the laboratory across the street, they don't spontaneously develop Parkinson's disease. They don't spontaneously develop Alzheimer's disease. If we recognize that these are preventable diseases, if we hold our representatives accountable, if we find our voice, if 1 million people with Parkinson's disease during World Parkinson's Disease Month, this month, find their voice, we'll ban Paraquat, we'll get rid of these toxins in our environment, we'll change the course for the people who already have the disease, and we will give the gift of future generations ad infinitum, a world where Parkinson's disease perhaps doesn't exist, where it is rare, where it's not described in the medical literature except in the history books. And as a neurologist, I can't think of a better gift than giving a world a future where the diseases that I care for no longer exist.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for the presentation and sharing your knowledge with our audience today. If we could unmute the audience so they could share their appreciation with Dr. Dorsey, please.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.